Okay, so mission is a constantly changing phenomenon. And so what I'm speaking about today is the changing face of mission. As Fee said, I'm Sue Barclay from All Nations. We're a mission training college in Hertfordshire. Please come and talk to us afterwards. We've got some exhibition space there, and we'll be happy to tell you all about our courses. But let's talk first about mission, the changing face of mission. And let's start at the beginning with that. Because in order to talk about change, we need to talk about history. Obviously, this is our starting point. Jesus saying, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." That mandate for mission, that instruction that we need to take the good news out, remains an important mandate for us all. And as Andrew Walls, the mission historian, pointed out, Christianity has always lived by crossing cultural frontiers, from Judea to Samaria, from Samaria to the Gentiles, from Asia to Europe, from, all around the world. We've always lived by crossing cultural frontiers. And thinking about mission history, we can see that actually Christianity has always been on the move. This graphic here shows the trajectory of the centre of gravity of Christianity from the year 33, the year of the death and resurrection of Jesus, through to the current day. And you can see that this point, the geographical point where there were equal numbers of Christians, east, west, north and south, moves as we go through the centuries because the spread of Christianity moves. So initially it's just in Judea. And then in the first few hundred years, it's centred in the sort of Asia Minor area, recognising that dominance of Greek Christianity, Roman Christianity, but also all that's happening out to the east, which we often forget about, which pulls that centre of gravity into that sort of area. And then as the churches in the east die out, as Islam comes in, and as the gospel spreads westwards with colonialism, we see the centre of gravity moving across the map. So by 1500, it's in sort of Central Europe. By 1900, all the mission activities that have been going on in the West and in the South, we see that the centre of gravity is roughly in central Spain. There's equal numbers of Christians, north, south, east and west of that point by that time. But then begins the big march south. And that's really noticeable on this map, isn't it? That by 1950, the centre of gravity has shifted down into the sort of African latitudes. And then by 2010, it's very definitely in West Africa. There are as many Christians south of that point in the rest of the world, south of that point, south of the equator, as there are north of the equator, and as many east and west. And then the trajectory as it plots onwards is only going to be more of the same, moving south all the time. Christianity has always been on the move. This is not a new thing. And so when we're talking about changes in the missions world, we're talking about tracking our mandate to take the gospel to the whole world through this changing geography of where most Christians live. Here's a picture from the World Missionary Conference in 1910. And if you just look at that picture for a little bit, you will notice something about the people who are there. They are overwhelmingly white. They are overwhelmingly male. They are all Protestant. And there's a really kind of narrow sense of what the world missionary movement is actually about at that time. And yet, if we could, can we move that Zoom window a little bit? Yeah. As Andrew Walls said, this conference marked a high point in the modern Western missionary movement, a time of actually coming together of mission agencies wanting to collaborate in talking and thinking about mission, and yet also was the high point from which it declined because things began to change in the West after this. But it also was the point at which Christians first began to glimpse something of what a world church would be like, because there were people who were involved in mission all around the world, even if they weren't the delegates who were sent to that conference. Actually, if we look at who was there, just click back into that window. It included delegates from a range of mission societies, about 500 British, about 500 American, about 170 from the rest of Europe, and 19 delegates from what they called the younger churches of Africa and Asia. It was overwhelmingly Western, and yet it did represent a heart for mission, a heart for reaching the world. These were all people who were actively involved in that. It's a picture of how mission was understood back then in 1910, basically from the West to the rest. So what's changed since then? We need to ask this question: where in the world do most Christians live? I think it's obvious from that trajectory that I used earlier that Christians are spread all around the world. It's no longer true that most Christians are in the global north. It's no longer true that most Christians are in Europe and America. If you look at this map, which comes from 2020, you can see massive populations of Christians in Brazil, in Nigeria, in the Philippines, in China, in India, in Russia, all over the world, massive populations of Christians. It is not just a Western phenomenon. And so our thinking about mission needs to reflect that. This rather scary looking picture, I'll just move that again. I'm highlighting just the top line because I want us to be clear that although in the West we often hear a narrative of decline, that the churches are declining, the churches are closing, etc., etc. Notice that across the top column, top row of that table, this is the percentage of Christians in the world. It is roughly constant. So the population of the world has massively grown in that period from 1900 to 2050, but the number of Christians, the percentage of Christians, has remained roughly constant. Around a third of the world's population are Christian, just as they were back in 1910. However, when we look at the distribution of those Christians, I want to highlight something different. I've put an arrow next to the global north row and the global south row. And you can see that in 1900, there were approximately 460 million Christians in the global north and approximately 98 million in the global south. So a significant proportion, 4/5 of world Christians lived in the global north. By now, it is completely reversed. So 1.8 billion Christians in the global south and about 830 million Christians in the global north. So 2/3 of all Christians live in the global south. And this has to change the way that we think about mission. The implications of this: in 2024, more than 2/3 of all Christians are in the global south. By 2050, that will increase even further. About 3/4 of all Christians are in the global south. More Christians live in Africa than any other continent. And Christianity is a majority global south religion. We need to get our heads around that. We need to stop thinking that the global north can or should set the agenda. Here's a picture of the change in the Christian population since 1970. You can see in red those places where Christianity has declined, and in blue those places where Christianity has increased. The same story being told. It is growing in the majority world. It is growing in the global south at the same time as it is declining in the previous traditional heartlands of Christianity. So there are these shifts in global Christianity. The West does seem to be becoming less Christian. Western mission does have to deal with that legacy of cultural imperialism, of colonization that still dogs our heels. And that is a challenge to Western mission. For the first time in the latest census, less than half of the population of England and Wales defined themselves as Christian at all. That's a significant shift. And in this quote from Renee Padilla, I think he makes a really important point that if you continue to impose Western models on a majority non-Western Christianity, you're not going to be able to meet their needs. You're just, in fact, going to hold back the churches. He says, if you do that, you cannot but retard indefinitely the growth of indigenous churches, rooted in their own culture and capable of making their own theological contribution. Christianity is changing, and mission needs to be changing in step with that. So what do we do about this? These challenges to the traditional West to the rest models of mission. Yes, the West does seem to be becoming less Christian, but does that mean that those who are Christian should do nothing? Does that mean we have nothing to contribute? No, it doesn't, because we still have that mandate to go into all the world with the gospel. There is this anxiety about cultural imperialism. It's a right thing to be concerned about. An understanding of culture does matter. An awareness of power does matter. So the question is not, should we be doing it at all, but how can we be doing it better in a way that better reflects the fact that those of us who are based in the global north are a minority in world Christianity. In the report from those people who produce those statistics, they make the point that the decline of Christianity in the global north is being outpaced by the rise of Christianity in the global south, and that most of us are still unclear about the implications of that. We're trying to carry on with business as usual, and we just can't do that anymore. It's not possible, and it's not legitimate to try and do that. Christianity is a world religion, and that means it's rich in diversity. We need to just get our heads around the fact that most Christians are not Western, not European, not American. Most Christians do not share that cultural heritage. And Western answers to Western questions are just not relevant to many parts of the church. So how does this change the nature of mission? I want to say that it's not a question of should we be involved in mission, but how should we be involved in mission? Yes, we should all be involved in mission. The question is how? How can we do this in a way that reflects the reality of the global church? The first key shift, I think, is to adopt a body of Christ perspective, that we are partners. We are working alongside local churches. Those of us who are from the global north are not automatically going to be leaders. We are not going to be Western saviours. We need to have that attitude of humility that I heard talked about this morning, and recognise the contributions of all of God's people. But we are still responsible for bringing the gifts that God has given us. Also, continuing on the same theme, how should we do it? Another key shift is, rather than being from the West to the rest, we're now talking about mission as polycentric, having many centres. Mission is from anywhere to anywhere. I've had the great pleasure of being evangelised by a Zimbabwean in my hometown of Southend, and it was a pleasure to find someone wanting to share the gospel with me. He'd come to England to share the gospel with the godless British, and that's a wonderful thing. The West is not the centre of Christianity, because there is no centre of Christianity. It is a global faith. And so Christians from all parts of the world are going in mission and should be going in mission. Those of us who are Western can still be part of that, but we need to lay down some of those inherited attitudes about it kind of being controlled or led or dominated from the West, all that cultural arrogance. Those of us from the West need to go with a servant heart, but we do still need to go. A couple of theological points to finish with. If we're looking for an example of how to do mission, then here is the example. Cruciform, cross-shaped mission. Our mission should be cross-shaped. Our example is Jesus, who, being in very nature God, humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And so, as Steve Holmes says, just as purposeful, cruciform
self-sacrificial sending is intrinsic to God's own life. That's how God did mission. So being sent in a cruciform, purposeful, and self-sacrificial way must be intrinsic to the church being the church. So why do we still need to do mission? Because the gospel has always crossed borders. The world does need good news. The world does need God's people. And it is God's mission. It's not a question of should we do it, it's a question of how we should do it. And there is a changed face of mission, which increasingly organisations are becoming aware of and are training their people in to represent mission in this new way. Christianity is constantly encountering new cultures and contexts, and that demands new responses because it's always on the move. The gospel has always crossed borders, and it still needs to today.